International News Edition. His Majesty the King meets Libya's army commander and pledges continued support of Libya's efforts to restore security and stability. Yemeni President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi appoints his former Prime Minister as Vice President in a move to improve the chances of a peaceful settlement in Yemen. And Hillary Clinton kicks off her campaign to become the first female president of the United States. Good evening and very warm welcome to the news. His Majesty the King received the commander of the Libyan army, General Khalifa Haftar, who is currently on a visit to the kingdom. The meeting held at Al Husseiniya Palace dealt with the current regional developments, mainly the situation in Libya and efforts to counter terrorism and terrorist gangs. His Majesty pledged Jordan's continued support to Libya in its efforts to restore security and stability in the country and confront terrorist organizations that threaten the unity of Libya and its people. The meeting also touched on cooperation between the two countries, mainly in the military field. The Libyan army commander also discussed with His Majesty the King's military advisor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mish'al Zebin, military cooperation between the two countries. Zebin and Haftar discussed ways of enhancing cooperation, especially rebuilding the Libyan army and providing the necessary consultation in this area, as well as developing ties between the armed forces of the two countries. The United States and European powers have called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Libya, with talks resuming between Libya's rival factions in Algeria. A bomb exploded at the gates of the Moroccan embassy in the Libyan capital, Tripoli. There were no reports of injuries, but security officials reported damage to cars nearby. The explosion occurred just hours after 2 people were shot dead outside South Korea's embassy. Militants loyal to Daesh terrorist organization claimed responsibility for both attacks, the latest in a series of assaults against foreigners, embassies and oil fields in Libya. In Algiers, representatives of Libyan political parties and political activists met for a second round of talks aimed at paving the way for a transitional government. The special representative of the United Nations Secretary General, Bernardino Leon, said a political solution was close.
At the same time, we are enhancing that we are close to a political solution. We have to remind that there are still many difficulties. There are still many challenges. And we must also remind today that there has been 2 recent attacks against embassies in Tripoli, against the Korean embassy and against the Moroccan embassy. And we want to send from here our solidarity with these countries.
Yemeni President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi appointed his former Prime Minister as Vice President. The appointment of Khalid apparently aims at improving the chances of a peaceful settlement to the civil war in Yemen. Meantime, the Saudi-led coalition launched more air raids on the city of Aden. One of the targets was a site held by soldiers loyal to former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, who joined up with Houthi fighters against local militias in the south. This report has more.
Fierce clashes raged between Iranian allied Houthi militia and loyalists of President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi in southern Yemen. The main southern city of Aden saw the heaviest fighting, with medics and military forces saying at least 30 people were killed. 40 Houthi fighters were reported to have surrendered to local militiamen in a mosque. The Saudi-led airstrikes are meant to halt the Houthi advance towards the southern port city. Smoke was rising from the Yemeni presidential palace in Aden after coalition jets attacked the Houthis in the city. The Saudi forces also pounded Houthi targets with heavy artillery on the Yemen border. As the battles went on, humanitarian groups struggled to bring aid into the country and said the situation was deteriorating rapidly. residents of Aden queued up for food and petrol amid shortages of supplies.
We have to stand in line for bread, as you can see, and lines for petrol and diesel. Power is out. People have no water. They have nothing. We urge the government to find us a solution.
In a move aimed at dialogue in the war-ravaged country, Yemen's former Prime Minister Khalal was sworn in as Vice President in a ceremony at Yemen's embassy in Saudi Arabia. Bahah is popular across Yemen's spectrum of feuding parties and may be seen as a figure who could calm tensions and bring warring parties to the negotiating table. Saudi Arabia and allied Arab countries are trying to shore up support for Yemeni President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi. They hope the airstrikes they launched about 3 weeks ago would slow the advance of the Houthi militias towards the southern port city of Aden. Loy Balkar for the news at 10.
The United Nations Syria envoy Staffan de Mistura is proposing to hold consultations in Geneva on new political talks more than a year after UN-led peace talks collapsed. Sources say the initiative follows a request by UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon for a relaunch of a political process. In the ongoing Syrian conflict, an airstrike by government forces hit a school in the main northern city of Aleppo, killing 9 civilians, including 5 children. Kurdish officials and a monitor said Kurdish militia made headway into Syria's northern Raqqa province, where the extremist Daesh group has set up its de facto capital. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said the Kurdish People's Protection Units took over a large cement factory and 3 villages northwest of the town of Ain Isa. It said the Kurdish forces had fought fierce clashes against Daesh in the past 48 hours and were now in control of several villages in the area. In Iraq, Daesh militants breached the security perimeter around the country's largest refinery in Beji, but were beaten back by security forces and airstrikes by the US-led coalition. The refinery was under siege for 5 months after Daesh militants tore through Iraq last summer. Security forces drove the militants out of their nearby town of Beji in November. A member of Salahuddin Provincial Council said the situation was under control, although the refinery is within a range of fire from outside the perimeter of the complex, which covers an area of around 20 square kilometers. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas met Russia's leader Vladimir Putin to discuss the current state of Palestinian-Israeli relations and armed conflicts in the Middle East. The talks took place at Putin's residence outside Moscow. The Kremlin press service also said among the topics discussed were trade and economic relations between the two sides and development of tourism. Putin said that as the situation grows more difficult in the Middle East, it is important to hold consultations on the full range of issues, primarily the Palestinian-Israeli issue and the situation in Syria, Iraq and Yemen. Moscow has refrained from voicing support to one side in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, traditionally maintaining good relations with both parties. Abbas said the parties should do their best to achieve peace only through negotiations. Back here at home, Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour ordered the formation of a National Committee for Human Resources Development. The 13-member panel, formed at the behest of His Majesty the King, is headed by former Higher Education Minister Wajih Awais. The committee is tasked with preparing for an inclusive national conference to come up with a human resources development strategy, starting from early childhood until reaching the labour market. The strategy, that will be based on feasible programs and clear measurement criteria, will set out reform priorities and financing options at hand, as well as measures to streaming the labour market. The strategy will be passed to the Cabinet for endorsement to become a fixed and solid approach for consecutive governments. The Prime Minister led a ministerial team on a visit to the northern governorate of Ajloun and listened to a number of demands raised by the region's lawmakers, dignitaries and elders. At a meeting held at the Ajloun National University, Mansour stressed on sound planning and quality projects underway to achieve development in the governorate. The Prime Minister noted that a number of projects are now underway and pledged to meet the demands of the local residents according to priorities. Mansour announced the allocation of 10 million dinars over the next 10 years to finance the various ventures being implemented by the region's municipalities, which are in debt to the Cities and Villages Development Bank. The Prime Minister also directed the Ministers of Municipalities, Water and Irrigation, Agriculture, Public Works and Housing to take the necessary measures to address the demands raised by the residents of Ajloun. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry raised concerns with his Russian counterpart over Russia's decision to lift a ban on missile deliveries to Iran. White House spokesman Josh Earnest told reporters that Russia's decision to start an oil for goods swap could also raise sanctions concerns. In Iran, meanwhile, President Hassan Rouhani insisted his country will only sign a final nuclear accord with 6 world powers if all sanctions are lifted on the same day. In a joint meeting of Rouhani's administration and parliament, the president said Iran had never sought to produce atomic weapons and will never do so in the future. Iran and the West are working towards a June 30th deadline for a final deal on Tehran's nuclear program, which Western powers fear is aimed at developing an atomic bomb. Tehran says it is purely peaceful. Sudanese voters headed to the polls at the start of a 3-day election boycotted by the main opposition parties. The presidential and parliamentary elections are the first since Sudan saw its south secede in 2011, losing a third of its land and nearly all of its oil production. President Omar Hassan al-Bashir appears on course to extend his quarter-century in power. Bashir has cast himself as a guarantor of stability as his security forces tackle insurgencies in the western territory of Darfur and along the border with South Sudan. His campaign speeches have also addressed improving the economy, in which inflation and unemployment remain high. Those boycotting the votes say a clampdown on the opposition and civil society has created an impossible environment to compete against Bashir. The boycott means voters are left to choose between Bashir's National Congress Party and a handful of relatively new groups. Former U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton kicked off her campaign to become the first female president of the United States. She set out for a tour of key states a day after announcing her bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. Clinton first took a road trip to meet small groups of voters in Iowa. The reaction to her presidential bid was mostly positive, but others had some reservation. This report has more.
Girl power. Girl power.
As news of Hillary Clinton's second run for the White House begins to settle in, some women in Times Square express support.
I think she's an awesome woman with experience. She has that it that's going to make the difference. She's going to drive it home.
I think so. She's worked very hard to get to where she's at. And I believe there should be a woman president. It's time already.
But others said her window of opportunity may already be closed.
But I think in today's turmoil, I'm not sure she would be the right person to lead us.
Being a good president, the only time will tell. You know, it's like with everyone else.
Clinton's 2008 bid for the Democratic nomination was heavily criticized for conveying a sense of arrogance and entitlement. This time, she's hoping to portray herself as a more empathetic figure.
Yeah, I think that she would make a good president, yes.
And maybe we need a woman. Maybe.
According to a Reuters Ipsos tracking poll, Clinton is supported by more than 60% of Democrats.
Germany's Angelique Kerber cruised past American Madison Keys 6-2, 4-6, 7-5 in an enthralling match to win the final of the Family Circle Cup. Keys looked nervous and out of sorts as she was broken 3 times in the first set. But she battled back in the second, breaking to win the set after a series of serves where Kerber pushed her all the way. Keys then broke out to a 4-1 lead in the third set, but Kerber won 6 of the next 7 games, breaking to go 6-5 up and then serving out to Love to secure the championship. To the European clay court season and the Monte Carlo Masters, Austrian Andreas Heider-Mora thrashed Ernest Gulbis with a straight sets victory. The Austrian comfortably dispatched Gulbis 6-1, 6-love after just an hour of play. Another winner was Ukraine's Alexander Dolhopolov, who beat Borna Coric of Croatia 7-5, 5-7, 6-2. Real Madrid winger Gareth Bale is match fit to face Atletico Madrid in the Champions League quarter-finals first leg. Coach Carlo Ancelotti backed the forward in a news conference previewing Real's Champions League match against city rivals Atletico, saying, and I quote, "Bale had a fantastic season last year and he's having a really good season until now." There have been other positive signs for Real in recent weeks following the return of Luka Modric and James Rodriguez from injury. Atletico are seeking revenge against Real Madrid for last season's Champions League final defeat. Now the weather forecast: cold in most regions tonight and foggy across the hilly areas, with frost expected in the desert and the highlands as well. A slight rise in temperatures tomorrow will create fair weather in the hilly areas and warm across the Jordan Valley. A high of 28 degrees is forecast for the Dead Sea area. Winds will be northwesterly moderate, changing to northeasterly light in the evening hours. And the port of Aqaba should expect some pleasantly warm weather with calm seas. Now the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. Now, our top stories once again. His Majesty the King meets Libya's army commander and pledges continued support of Libya's efforts to restore security and stability. Yemeni President Abd Rabbu Mansour Hadi appoints his former Prime Minister as Vice President in a move to improve the chances of a peaceful settlement to the civil war in Yemen. And Hillary Clinton kicks off her campaign to become the first female president of the United States. And that's the end of tonight's news. My name is Ra'ad Lubtoush. Thank you so much for your company.